And by their act, Session 26, they appoint the confession and covenant should be afterwards subscribed according to the determination of the said free and lawful General Assembly at Glasgow. Besides the processes brought before this assembly against the bishops, there were also processes laid before them from the presbyteries against several ministers, either for reading the liturgy or for other scandalous practices, and many of them were deposed from the ministry, such as Dr. Hamilton, minister at Glassford, procurator of the bishops, Dr. Panther, professor of divinity at St. Andrews, Mr. Mitchell, minister at Edinburgh, and Mr. Gladstone at St. Andrew, with several others, as the reader may see from the Latin history. The same historian likewise reports that before censure was passed upon the teachers of Arminianism and other corrupt doctrine, Mr. David Dixon and Mr. Robert Bailey, and according to the journal some others, had learned discourses before the assembly upon the several points of Arminianism, proving their contrariety to the Holy Scriptures and other received doctrine. The assembly likewise gave 8 commissions to several ministers, who were appointed to meet at the places named in the several acts, for trying or judging ministers or professors in the colleges who were guilty of error, or who had submitted to the liturgy, and who refused to submit to the acts and constitutions of this assembly, or who were otherwise scandalous in their practice. And among the last things done by this assembly, a solemn thanksgiving was appointed to be observed through all the churches in this land for the success that the Lord had given unto them. There are 2 excellent speeches at the conclusion of this assembly, the one by the moderator, the other by Mr. David Dixon, wherein the right and progress of this great work of God are mentioned with thankfulness to the Lord. I dare not swell this book with giving even the heads of them. Likewise, at the moderator's desire, the Earl of Argyll spoke to excellent purpose. Then the assembly was concluded with prayer and singing of the 133rd Psalm, and they all parted with the greatest harmony and joy. I have now given an account, though but a very short and imperfect one, of that glorious appearance of the Lord for this church in the year 1638. The want of a full and faithful history of this wonderful turn is a very considerable loss unto this church, and I am persuaded that the author of the essay, if he had been acquainted with the history of this period, would not have treated the Assembly 1638 in the manner which he has done. Before I close this section, I shall, to prevent repetition, take notice of some considerable differences betwixt the proceedings of this church in the year 1638 and the management of all ranks of persons, and particularly of the General Assembly 1690. And that, because the Associate Presbytery, in their Judicial Act and Testimony, pages 38, 39, etc., make mention of some considerable omissions at the Revolution, as also because the author of the essay, page 126 and 127, endeavors to vindicate these omissions, and represents this church as more faithful at the Revolution than in her former period. I do not judge it needful to pursue our author in all the particulars that he alleges against the Assembly 1638, some of which he repeats over and over again, and always in a manner very diminutive of our reforming period. And before I enter upon particulars, I must observe that when the Associate Presbytery, in their Act and Testimony, page 37, make mention of the year 1388, they speak of the Revolution that year as a glorious and surprising appearance of God for us. And they had good reason to do so, as likewise they judged their duty to commemorate with thankfulness the divine power and goodness manifested in this wonderful work. It was a work of God, which ought to be remembered till the latest posterity. It was a work whereby deliverance was given us from tyranny and slavery, and whereby a stop was put to an inundation of popish idolatry and superstition. Yet the Presbytery do justly observe that it is to be regretted that this valuable season was neglected, and that the deliverance that was given us was not suitably improven. Though he saved us for his name's sake, yet we provoked him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. We forgot his works, and waited not for his counsel. From the historical account I have given, the reader may observe the following things. First, the Lord's work in the year 1638 was carried on with fasting, deep humiliation, and mourning, and acknowledgments made by all ranks of persons of the breach of our national covenant. Scotland at that time might be called Hokiem, or a place of mourners. The voice of weeping and supplication was heard amongst us because we had perverted our way, and forgotten the Lord our God. But in the year 1688, the estates of the nation were more concerned in securing their civil liberties than in appearing for the rights and liberties of the kingdom of Christ, or in laying seriously to heart their heinous perfidy and treachery in breach of covenant, though this was highly aggravated above what it was in their period before 1638. Neither did the ministry of the church in their judicial capacity lay home the particular instances of their perfidy and treachery unto the estates of the kingdom, in order to stir them up to humiliation and mourning before the Lord. Secondly, all ranks of persons in the land were sensible of their heinous defections and backslidings in the year 1638. So the representatives of this church, when they met in the General Assembly the said year, they came together under a sense of the same. And when some doubted if episcopacy and the 5 Articles of Perth were abjured by our national confession, as it was sworn in the year 1538, the assembly fully satisfied many that were in the dark upon this important question, and a general submission through the land was given unto the determinations of the General Assembly in this point. Further, were not all the proceedings of this assembly with respect to episcopacy, the 5 Articles of Perth, the oaths and entrance, with others I have mentioned, a particular and express condemning of their national steps of defection? As for what is affirmed by our author, that there were no fasts appointed in the year 1638 or 1639, he ought to have known that the work was carried on with fasting and humiliation, and that the assembly 1638 had ground for appointing a solemn thanksgiving for the great things the Lord had done for them. And whereas he asserts on page 136 that when a national fast is appointed in the year 1642, they were far from being so particular as the Assembly 1690. He might likewise have known that the Assembly 1638 did particularly and expressly condemn, as is above observed, the steps of defection and backsliding that had taken place before that time. But in the act appointing the fast 1690, there is no particular nor express mention of any steps of defection as contrary to our national confession of faith or our solemn league and covenant. When they mention the alteration of the government of the church, they say that, quote, prelacy was introduced without the church's consent and contrary to standing acts of our national assemblies, unquote, but do not declare that it ought to be mourned over, as contrary to our national oath and confession of faith. But it is declared by the mouth of the assembly, 1638, to be a transgressing of the covenant of the Lord, and acknowledged as a course of defection from it. It is likewise told in the said Act 1690 that much innocent blood had been shed, but they never tell that it was the blood of witnesses for the testimony of Jesus that was shed. Innocent blood may be shed in a land by tumult, in robberies, and in quarrels, and many other ways. Therefore posterity can never know what innocent blood is intended by the said Act of Assembly. If our author would give credit unto the late Reverend Mr. Hogg, to whose authority he frequently appeals, he tells us in his life writ by himself that after the happy revolution, under the specious name of prudence and just moderation, the testimony of former times was suppressed, and that it was not thought a proper season to intermeddle with their covenants or defections from them, that we might not give the least umbrage to those that were in the government, many of whom were not of our principles, and some had been amongst the leaders in the former persecution. Our author, page 135, when he speaks concerning the complaint made against the church at the Revolution for not being more particular in acknowledging steps of defection in church and state, he answers that some things reckoned steps of defection were debatable points, quote, but for other defections in which they were clear, they have not been so silent as is alleged, unquote. And, for proof of this, he tells us that in the Act of Assembly 1690 they expressly confess, quote, the late, great, and general defection of this church and kingdom, unquote. Also, quote, too general of fainting under this great defection, not only amongst professors, but also amongst ministers, yea, even amongst such who, in the main thing, did endeavor to maintain their integrity, not giving seasonable and necessary testimony against the defections and evils of that time, and keeping a due distance from them, unquote. But Why does not our author add what follows? That is, quote, and some, on the other hand, manage their zeal with too little discretion and meekness, unquote. But what is in all this express confession that our author speaks of? We are told of defections, great and general defections, fainting, indiscreet zeal. But what these defections were, we are not told. Mr. Hogg in his Life tells us, when speaking of the above-mentioned complaint, it is true, several public sins were then controverted, yet sure there were many sins beyond dispute, and the confession of these was neglected through carnal prudence and man-pleasing. Thirdly, this whole church and land returned unto the Lord in the year 1638 by a solemn renovation of their national covenant, accommodated to their situation and circumstances at that time. Thereby she not only made a solemn profession and confession of her God, in opposition unto the dishonors that were done him, and the indignities that were offered unto the ordinances of his institution, with respect to the government, discipline, and worship of his house, but also she did with the same solemnity acknowledge and avouch the several articles of faith laid down from the Word of God in our Confession of Faith. But at the Revolution, the National Church of Scotland was not a covenanting church. She made no such solemn profession or confession of the truths or ordinances of her God, in opposition unto a highly aggravated violation and profanation of them for the space of 28 years of unparalleled apostasy and defection. Fourthly, the Assembly 1638, in their 16th session, expressly condemn episcopacy as contrary to the Word of God and our National Confession of Faith. But nothing like this was done by the Assembly 1690. This omission was attended with several special aggravations, as, for instance, the testimony of the Church of Scotland had been stated more particularly and expressly against prelacy in the year 1638 than formerly, when the said Assembly declared prelacy to be abjured by our national covenant, and when the covenant, according to this express declaration, was afterwards sworn and subscribed by all ranks of persons through the land. Hence the above omission in 1690 was a material part of the testimony of this church, which had been stated in such a particular and express manner. Likewise, episcopacy in its form and model was far more tyrannical, as it was reared up by our Scots Parliament in the year 1661, than it was in the period before the year 1638. For, as I have already observed, the Assembly at Glasgow 1610, which brought in episcopacy into the church, did not allow of the bishop as a distinct officer from preaching elder. Neither did the Parliament 1612, which ratified the proceedings of Glasgow Assembly, consider the bishop as a distinct office from presbyters. But when prelacy is reared up in the year 1662, as Mr. Woodrow in his history observes, not only a negative, but likewise a positive is given, and all church power and government is lodged in his sole person. Hence episcopacy was not only considered as a distinct office from presbyters, but upon the matter the bishop is constitute the sole officer in the house of God. Therefore the omission of the Assembly 1690 was still more aggravated in regard. The order and government of the house of God in Scotland has been much more subverted in the period before 1688 than in that before the year 1638. Likewise, by the rearing up of prelacy in the year 1662, the land was more deeply involved in perjury than in the period before 1638. In regard, it was a breach not only of the national covenant, as it was explained by the Assembly 1628, but also of the solemn legal covenant, which both the king and all ranks of persons in Scotland had sworn with great solemnity. When all these things are considered, 'tis very manifest that the above omission at the Revolution was attended with special and heinous aggravations. It is likewise justly complained, Act and Testimony, page 40, that the Assembly 1690 did not assert the divine right of presbytery. Unto this the author of the essay makes answer, page 129.